So thank you for joining me today as we discuss the changes to the OREF Residential Forms Library that are being implemented for our 2026 annual release. My name is Wendy Atkinson, and I'm a member of the OREF Education Committee. First, I'll explain the new forms that will be added to the OREF library, and then we'll review the changes being made to existing forms. I want to point out that most of the changes you'll see today are a direct result of feedback from subscribers like you who have submitted a question or a suggestion to OREF. If you have suggestions for new forms or improvements to our existing library, please email those to customerservice@orefonline.com. All the changes we will cover today, since it is still December, will be live in your OREF library by January 2nd, 2026. Members of the OREF staff are also joining me today to help answer any questions you may have. Okay, so let's get started. On January 1st of 2026, House Bill 3137 takes effect, bringing with it a new set of Oregon administrative rules and revised statutes. I'm sure many of you have heard about 3137. Along with these updates come two important defined terms, managing principal broker and authorized principal broker. Many of us in the industry have used the term managing principal broker for years when referring to the supervising principal broker because we didn't have any other way to describe that person who's in charge, who's accountable for everything. So that term may, already feel familiar to you, but House Bill 3137 now uses this term when referring specifically to the principal broker who manages the entire firm, meaning they are in charge of the firm, its trust account, establishing the main office and any branches, and managing the brokers and supervising the brokers and other principal brokers. The term authorized principal broker, however, introduces something new. An authorized principal broker is a principal broker who's been authorized by the managing principal broker through a written supervisory agreement to oversee one or more licensees who are currently under the supervision of the managing principal broker. So these are your team leads, the person that's supervising a specific group of agents on behalf of the managing principal broker. To make this simpler and more consistent, I wanted to mention that OREF forms now primarily use the term authorized principal broker to identify the principal broker who supervises an agent or group of agents. Depending on the firm structure, that could mean either a managing principal broker or an authorized principal broker. This approach makes sense since every managing principal broker is also an authorized principal broker, right? They've authorized themselves to oversee the agents if they have not appointed an authorized principal broker, a separate authorized principal broker to do that. So as a result, you will see the term authorized principal broker throughout the 2026 OREF forms. Let's begin by reviewing the newest forms added to the OREF Residential Library. We have two new forms that were added to the OREF Library earlier in 2025, and then we will cover the three new forms that will go live in 2026. So you can see those on your screen. First is the new OREF 000B, Advisory for Buyers and Sellers of Real Estate. And this was highly requested, so it was released ahead of the January 2026 update. It is already available for you in your library on your transaction platforms, and a sample file and training materials can be accessed on the OREF website. This new advisory applies to both parties and keeps information consistent and easy to access. It includes many of the topics that OREF covers in our detailed individual advisories, along with new topics designed to inform consumers about the various things involved in a real estate transaction. With links to our detailed advisories live in this document, clients can easily read through the more in-depth information when a specific issue applies to their situation. We recommend that agents share this new advisory with all clients, both buyers and sellers, early in your relationship with your client. It helps prepare them for the real estate process and answers many of the questions that come up along the way. So this is a great new tool we were excited to release. Also, we've received a lot of feedback that solar panels can create confusion for both consumers and real estate professionals. To help address this, we've developed a new form, OREF 116, Advisory Regarding Solar Panels. It gives buyers and sellers detailed information about what to expect when a real estate transaction involves a solar panel system. There are sections covering financial agreements, system documentation, installation and maintenance, net metering and utility transfer, and homeowners insurance. All of this information is important to consider when a property contains solar panels. So a solar panel system is not always owned outright by the seller. They might be leased or subject to some other kind of financial agreement. Because there is a contract between the seller and a third party, the buyer needs to know what the contract says and what happens to the contract when the property is sold. The advisory helps with all of those questions. It also serves as a valuable educational resource for agents. If you're not familiar with solar panel systems, pull up when this class is over the advisory. It's there in your library now, and you can review it and educate yourself on solar panel systems. Because this advisory is linked in the new advisory for buyers and sellers of real estate, it was also released ahead of the annual January update and is currently available on your transaction platforms. Training videos and handouts are also available on the OREF website. Now we'll look at the 3 new forms OREF has added to the residential library for 2026. First, let's review 000C, Real Estate Transaction Terms and Concepts. This form was created to help buyers and sellers understand words and phrases commonly used in real estate. It begins with a statement that it's not intended to provide legal advice, and legal questions should be directed to an attorney. But it provides explanations of the terms and phrases that we as agents commonly use in real estate, and it helps bridge that gap in communication when agents rely on familiar industry terms that may not be familiar to clients. So I think this is a great new invention, if you will, for consumers and for us as agents to be reminded that our clients don't always know the terms we're using, and this gives them a place to go reference and look it up. Beginning January 1st, as I mentioned, House Bill 3137 requires real estate teams to disclose information about all team members to their clients. To help teams meet the new requirement and remain compliant with the new law, OREF created 014 Real Estate Team Disclosure to assist with documenting this disclosure. The form gives an explanation, and this comes straight out of the statute, guys, that a real estate team is made up of 1 or more licensed real estate brokers who work together and provide real estate services under a name that is different from the brokerage name. Now, that's how they've defined it in the law. However, non-licensed parties can also be a part of a team, so keep that in mind as we go through this. It states that team members are required to deliver this team disclosure at first contact with a prospective party to a real estate transaction or to an unrepresented party seeking representation. Then the form provides a space to include the team name, the office address, and the office phone number. Below that section are blanks to list up to 6 team members. All team members that have been included in any advertising, whether licensed or not, must be disclosed. So that is part of the administrative rule as well, is that if you put them in your advertising, then they're considered part of your team, licensed or not, and they need to be included. For each member, there's a space to include their name, their role on the team, their license status, phone number, email address, and license number, if applicable. If they're not licensed, you can put an NA or just leave that blank. The final blanks on the form are for identifying the firm's managing principal broker and the team's authorized principal broker, if there is one, and a reminder that teams must execute a disclosed limited agency agreement anytime 1 or more members represent multiple parties in a transaction. Agents who are part of a real estate team should complete this form in advance so that it's ready to deliver when required. Since this is a new practice in our industry, agents who are part of a team should take time to review the requirements with their managing principal broker or authorized principal broker to ensure full compliance with the new law. Remember to always lean on your managing or authorized principal broker. The next new form to go live in 2026 is 058, Advisory Regarding Due Diligence. Form 058 was previously known, that number was identified as the Professional Inspection Addendum, which some agents used in place of the inspection section of the sale agreement. Feedback showed that many of the agents that preferred it did so because it outlined different types of inspections and served as an advisory resource. However, in some cases, that approach created potential risk management issues, depending on how thoroughly the agent discussed and documented inspection options with the client. So to reduce that risk, while continuing to provide valuable education information, the Professional Inspection Addendum was removed and converted to an advisory. This change aligns the form with its intended purpose of helping consumers better understand inspection and due diligence considerations, and it will also reduce liability for agents. The advisory includes a definition of the terms and due diligence of the term due diligence. So that's important. And a list of items that might be considered part of the due diligence process. We as agents throw that term around a lot without knowing for sure what we really mean when we say due diligence. It also clarifies that real estate agents are not qualified to offer advice on due diligence matters and confirms that property inspections are part of the due diligence process. And it offers examples of items that may be included in a suitability investigation. So that's the end of our new forms presentation. So I'd like to pause for a moment and ask Molly, are there any questions so far on the new forms that I've presented?
Not right now. We're good.
All right, awesome. Hopefully you're not all falling asleep and instead I'm explaining it well enough that you get it, but don't hesitate to put questions into the Q&A if you have any. Okay, so based on subscriber feedback, the committee's work over the past year and recent changes to Oregon law and administrative rules, many forms, look at this screen guys, many forms have been updated to ensure compliance and better align with how real estate transactions unfold in practice. Here's a list of forms that have been updated with substantial changes this year and which we will be covering today. So you can see why this is a 90-minute presentation. And continuing, a few more forms that have been updated with substantial changes this year. So we're going to do our best to get through all of these in 90 minutes. So let's start with the residential real estate sale agreement because it is the most frequently used form in the ORF library. Please note that any changes discussed here that were made to OREF 001 have also been carried over to all of the other sale agreements in the residential library where applicable. The first updates you will notice are significant modifications to the financing section of the agreement. So I really want to emphasize that these financing changes and inspection changes that we're about to dive into are big changes for the way that you use this form and do business. So please pay attention because it can feel a little overwhelming to all be presented at one time. We start with a new section 3, which you can see on your screen there, financing type. This section was added to clarify how to properly complete the financing portion of the agreement, and it includes 3 options for the buyer to choose from. So when you're writing your offer, you're going to check one of these boxes, A, B, or C. Option A is selected if the buyer is not obtaining financing and will be paying cash at closing, and then it directs you to complete section 7. Option B is selected if the buyer is obtaining financing from a third-party lender, and if so, then section 8 should be completed. And option C is selected if the seller will be providing the financing for the buyer, and then they should complete section 9. Then there is a new question. Notice that at the bottom of that screenshot there. Is this transaction contingent upon an appraisal? If the box for no is selected, this form clearly states that section 6, a brand new section in the form, appraisal contingency, does not apply. This selection applies to the transaction regardless of the type of financing if you mark the yes box. It's very important for agents to become familiar with this new question and to always check one of the boxes, yes or no. Doing so ensures that the buyer's intent regarding an appraisal contingency is clear to the seller at the time they receive the offer. That brings us to the next new section, Section 6, Appraisal Contingency. This section was added to give buyers the option to include a contingency requiring the property to appraise for at least the purchase price, even if the buyer is not obtaining financing. So this has been something that's come up a lot from or subscribers, that they would like to be able to include an appraisal contingency even if there's no financing involved. So this is a standalone section that can apply to any type of transaction, whether it's cash financed or seller carried financing. However, it only applies if the yes box above was checked. Notice there's no box in front of Section 6. It's yes or no up in Section 3. It's important for agents to understand that this appraisal contingency is now completely separate from the loan/financing contingency where it used to be included, which is now addressed in Section 8.1. Making sure the correct box is selected in Section 3 is essential to confirm the buyer's intent and to ensure the proper contingency is included. Section 6.1 outlines the appraisal contingency deadline. The buyer has the default of 20 business days after the effective date, which is defined as the appraisal contingency deadline, to have the property appraised and complete any necessary negotiations with the seller regarding the appraisal results. Notice these are business days, and there is a blank. You can modify that default of 20 days, but that's 4 weeks from acceptance to get your appraisal completed. It's important to note that this time frame functions similarly to the inspection contingency. Before the appraisal contingency deadline expires, the buyer must order the appraisal, have it completed, and finish all related negotiations with the seller if the appraisal results require any adjustments to the terms of the agreement. So that 20 business days is all encompassing. Section 6.2, Failure of Appraisal Contingency, explains what happens if the appraisal process and related actions are not completed by the appraisal contingency deadline. It begins by describing the 3 reasons the appraisal contingency might fail. If the appraisal is not received by the deadline, right? That's a problem. If the property appraises for less than the purchase price listed on page 2, or if the appraised value is conditioned upon the completion and approval of appraiser requirements, like different repairs or improvements. If any of these take place, the buyer must promptly notify the seller. Once the seller has been notified, the buyer has a default of 2 business days following the date of that notice to take one of 3 actions, and you can see those outlined on your screen. The first option is that the buyer and seller may reach a written agreement on a new price and terms that allows the transaction to continue. The next option says the buyer may choose to waive the appraisal contingency and proceed with the transaction. And the third option is the buyer may choose to terminate the transaction and receive a refund of their earnest money deposits. This section provides a clear framework for what happens when the appraisal results or timing create challenges, giving both parties defined steps and a timeline to follow. So there is the option with A to extend that appraisal contingency deadline, but that's going to require the seller to agree with the buyer. And if they can't come to an agreement and they don't want to waive the appraisal contingency, then this gives them the opportunity to terminate the transaction. Section 6.3, Appraisal Reinspection. This was in previous versions of the sale agreement, and it explains what happens if a second appraisal inspection, called a reinspection, becomes necessary due to a seller breach. If a reinspection is required because the seller breached the agreement, the seller is responsible for promptly reimbursing the buyer for the cost of that reinspection. Now, this is important because this is a change from previously. Keep in mind that this penalty only applies if the yes box for an appraisal contingency is checked in Section 3. So if we didn't say yes to the appraisal being a contingency, then the seller has no liability for the cost of an appraisal reinspection. Section 8.1, loan contingency, is a new addition that applies only if box B in section 3, financing type, is selected. So again, notice there are no boxes in front of these selections. Everything is defined and outlined and selected, if you will, in section 3. So if there is a loan contingency, you would have checked that box in section 3 and been directed to come here to section 8 to complete this section. This section explains that the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is contingent upon both the buyer and the property qualifying for the loan from the lender within a default of 20 business days after the effective date, referred to as the loan contingency deadline. This loan contingency is separate from the buyer's rights under the appraisal contingency in section 6. And it introduces a really important change, guys. There's now a specific deadline in the agreement for the buyer to receive loan approval. So if you remember, in the old agreements, the financing contingency was open-ended and basically extended through closing. Now we've got a default of 20 business days, so check with your lender from acceptance for us to satisfy that loan contingency, confirm the buyer's qualified, the property qualifies, everything's good, or choose another option. This new deadline creates a clear expectation for when loan approval should occur. Buyers and their agents need to be aware of this timeline and plan accordingly to make sure all financing steps are progressing toward approval before the deadline passes. Section 8.2, failure of loan contingency, explains the circumstances under which the buyer's loan contingency is considered to have failed. It begins by stating that if full loan approval is not received by the loan contingency deadline, or if the buyer receives written notice from the lender that the loan contingency has failed or cannot occur, the buyer must promptly notify the seller. Once that notice has been given, the buyer has a default, again, of 2 business days following the date of the delivery of buyer's notice to seller to take one of 3 actions. And you can see those there on your screen. Option A, the buyer and seller may reach a written agreement on a new price or terms that allows the transaction to continue. Option B, the buyer may choose to waive the loan contingency. And then buyers are advised to review the advisory to buyer regarding waiving contingencies before doing so. Or option C, the buyer may choose to terminate the transaction and receive a refund of their earnest money deposit. So if they haven't gotten their loan approval yet and the lender says, sorry, it's going to be a while, they can terminate and protect their earnest money. This section highlights the importance of buyers and their agents maintaining communication with the lender and acting quickly if issues arise, so the buyer can make an informed decision before the loan contingency deadline passes. Before we move on, because this section does create this new language change from financing contingency, which was all encompassing and included appraisal and financing, to now separate appraisal and loan contingencies, if the loan contingency is selected, I want to stop, Molly, and ask if there are any questions.
Wendy, we do have a question. It's a good one. Somebody's asking for the 20 business days in 8.1. Does that mean that it has to close and record by then?
Oh, good question. No, that is previously the loan financing contingency ran all the way up to closing. So you could have a seller who is packed up, rented a moving van, and in the process of moving out before they find out the buyer is not going to go forward because they didn't get their financing. Hopefully now this new 20 business day deadline occurs a little bit sooner in the transaction so that the seller is notified earlier that the transaction won't be proceeding. So we can close it anytime later after that date. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, good question. That's it?
Yep, that's it.
Okay, that's it. All right. So moving on.
Wendy, we have one more.
One more.
Somebody asks if this coincides with the intent to proceed.
Coincides with the intent to proceed. I'm not sure which section they're referring to about intent to proceed. But if they don't do anything during that 20-day contingency period, then the loan is deemed to have been approved and they lose the ability to terminate the transaction based upon that contingency. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll pause again as we get through the remainder of the sale agreement, but let's move on here to sections 9 and 10. You can see they have a strike through on your screen. They were previously titled property and casualty insurance and flood insurance, and they have been removed from the sale agreement. And you'll understand why here in a moment. These sections were originally included as reminders for buyers to check on the insurance options. But many subscribers requested, and believe me, we got repeated requests, that these topics be addressed as contingencies in the sale agreement instead. In response, the opportunity for buyers to investigate the cost and availability of insurance has now been incorporated into the new suitability section of the sale agreement, which we will discuss next. Insurance is also covered in the advisory for buyers and sellers of real estate, which provides additional information and guidance for clients on this topic. So those sections are gone, you'll notice. Now we have a new Section 12. It was previously titled Property Inspections, but has been almost completely rewritten. So it's now called Suitability and Inspections and expands on the buyer's options when evaluating a property. This section includes a recommendation that buyers obtain a professional inspection of the property and conduct thorough due diligence to determine whether the property is suitable for their intended use and needs. And there's that term due diligence again, so be sure to give them that advisory regarding due diligence. It advises them to read that here in this section and to seek guidance from qualified professionals if they have any questions or concerns. The section then provides instructions for how buyers can select their desired contingencies. If the buyer wants a suitability contingency, they should select Section 12.1. If instead, or additionally, they want an inspection contingency, they should select Section 12.2. We'll take a closer look at the details of both of these options next so you can understand how they work together. Where did this come from? Let's see here. Section 12.1 is a completely new section. This is the suitability contingency, and you can see that there is a checkbox in front of it. This section was created in response to numerous subscriber requests for a cleaner and more transparent way for buyers to terminate a transaction for reasons that are outside the scope of the inspection. In past transactions, there have been scenarios, and I'm sure you've all encountered these, where buyers chose to terminate the transaction for reasons unrelated to the condition of the property, but use the inspection contingency as the mechanism for termination. This created confusion and led sellers to believe that the termination was due to inspection issues, when in fact the reason may have been something entirely different, such as zoning or insurance costs or other suitability factors. When the sellers in these situations put their properties back on the market, other buyers sometimes assume the sales failed because of property condition. The new suitability contingency provides a clear and honest solution. It allows a buyer to disapprove of the property based on their own needs rather than relying on the inspection contingency as a catch-all. This section begins by stating that if the buyer is not satisfied with the property's suitability for their intended use, such as its future saleability, the cost or availability of casualty, property, or flood insurance, or zoning, or land use restrictions, the buyer has a default of 10 business days after the effective date, defined as the suitability period, to act. Within that time, if the buyer decides to terminate, they must deliver the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval to the seller. By doing so, within the suitability period, the buyer may terminate the transaction and receive a refund of their earnest money deposit. This new contingency ensures sellers understand the reason for termination is not related to a professional inspection. Importantly, it relieves the stigma on the property of having an inspection report result in a failed transaction. We've all had that happen, where our buyer is viewing the property with the inspector and the neighbor's dog is barking incessantly, and they are like, wait a minute, I don't want to live next to a barking dog. And so they unconditionally disapprove based on the inspection contingency, and the seller is misled that there was something wrong with the home that the buyer disapproved of. So now they can just be honest and say it doesn't work for my needs, and they don't have to identify what that issue was. Of course, they can choose to do that. I would just use caution if you're going to ask about it. Section 12.2, now titled Inspections or Waiver of Inspections, includes only minor updates. The inspection language itself remains essentially the same, but the section has been reorganized to make it easier to read and follow. It begins with a reminder that this section does not apply to inspections under the septic and on-site sewage addendum or the private well addendum, since those forms have their own timelines. That reminder was simply moved up in the section to make sure it's not overlooked. In section 12.2, the buyer must select one of the available options. Option 12.2A indicates that the buyer would like an inspection contingency. When this option is selected, the buyer continues to have the rights that they had previously under the old inspection language. The right to conduct professional inspections, request repairs, or terminate based on their findings within the inspection period, just like previous versions of the sale agreement. So it's just a reorganization. The verbiage is the same. Section 12.2B, buyer's waiver of inspection contingency, contains the same language as in previous versions of the sale agreement. Confirms that the buyer waives their right to terminate the transaction based on the results of an inspection, but still retains the right to have inspections performed for informational purposes only. Section 12.2C, buyer's waiver of inspections and inspection contingency, also remains unchanged. And section 12.2D, other inspection addendum, allows a buyer to attach and use a different inspection addendum of their choosing if they prefer. It's important to note that buyers now have several options within section 12. They can choose to have only a suitability contingency and waive the inspection contingency, to have only an inspection contingency and waive the suitability contingency, or they can choose to include both or neither. Because there are multiple ways that this section can be completed, it's essential for agents to read through, understand, and be able to explain each option. Notice the invasive inspection disclosure still exists. Then we have section 15, lead-based paint, which has been simplified. It's much shorter now to make it clearer and easier to complete. This section now includes simple yes and no checkboxes to indicate whether the property was constructed prior to 1978. This change was included to make it easier for managing principal brokers to review and approve paperwork quickly and accurately. So they now know whether they should be looking for a lead-based paint disclosure addendum. You'll also notice that this section now includes a 1 business day timeline for the seller's delivery to the buyer of the lead-based paint disclosure addendum, the EPA pamphlet, and all information, records, and reports the seller has relating to lead-based paint on the property. This timeline, this 1-day deadline, begins on the effective date and replaces the previous reference to the word promptly. We had a lot of subscribers commenting that they really didn't like having to interpret promptly in the various locations throughout the sale agreement. So where it made sense, we have clarified, and here it is 1 business day. Most of the timeline specific language that was previously included here in the sale agreement in this section has been removed and is now found in the updated lead-based paint disclosure addendum, which we will be covering today later in the presentation. Section 27, solar panel system. This is a significant change, guys. It includes a place for the buyer to indicate, as it always has, whether the property has solar panels. In previous versions of the sale agreement, if the answer was yes, the seller was instructed to provide the buyer with the solar panel system addendum. Based on subscriber feedback, this process has been updated. Now, if the property includes solar panels, the buyer is required to include the solar panel system addendum when submitting their offer. Because of this update, the buyer's agent will likely need to reach out to the seller's agent before preparing the addendum to confirm details about the solar panel system, including its financial status. There's no way for the buyer's agent to have that information unless they communicate with the seller's agent. Gathering that information ahead of time will help ensure the offer and addendum are accurate and complete when presented. The other thing that forcing the buyer to include the addendum does is it speeds up the timeframes. And that was the biggest concern expressed by subscribers, was that the amount of time allowed for by the time the buyer got the solar addendum and then all of the steps required in that addendum could often ride right up on the closing date. So we tried to speed everything up here by getting that addendum presented with the offer. New reporting requirements from the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Did you know that even existed? Commonly referred to by those of us who did know, I guess, that it existed. It's commonly referred to as FinCEN, go into effect on March 1st, 2026. These new requirements primarily impact title and escrow companies, and the sale agreement has been updated to include language that addresses them. In Section 30, escrow, language has been added, and you can see it highlighted there on your screen, to require that if the buyer is an entity or trust, both parties must provide escrow with all information needed for the escrow company to comply with the new FinCEN reporting requirements. The escrow company will usually not ask for information if an institutional lender, such as a bank or a credit union, is providing financing for the transaction. Because these rules apply only when the buyer is an entity or a trust, the section also clarifies that the buyer will be responsible for any charges from escrow related to the reporting. Pretty simple addition. The language in Section 33, closing, has been revised to clarify the intent and process for delivery of the closing disclosure and to align expectations with TRID requirements. It now reads, federal law requires buyer's lender to ensure that buyer receives a closing disclosure at least 3 business days before the date buyer signs loan documents. This update helps ensure everyone involved understands the timing requirements and the lender's responsibility for providing the closing disclosure. So remember, the closing disclosure is different from the closing statement provided by escrow, although occasionally escrow will be asked by the lender to also provide the closing disclosure. But in the end, it is the lender's responsibility. References to TRID were deleted because TRID is now familiar to agents, and referring to it doesn't provide any information to buyers and sellers, who are the ones this contract is built for. And that wraps up our review of the updates to the residential real estate sale agreement. So Molly, are there any questions about the updates we've covered so far?
Not yet. You're doing a great job. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. All right. So far, so good. We'll do our best to answer questions about the intent behind these changes as we proceed and how they are designed to work. And please keep in mind that some questions will need to be addressed directly with your managing principal broker, especially if they are transaction specific, which we get sometimes. Remember, your managing principal brokers are learning these updates right along with you right now. So communication and collaboration within your office will be key as everyone becomes familiar with these new changes. Now let's move on to the other forms that have been updated for 2026. Remember that big list we saw on that screen, on that one slide. First are the seller and buyer counteroffers. Both of these forms include an important change in Section 2, which addresses the expiration of the buyer's original offer and any counteroffers. This is a big change, guys. It's not as confusing as it feels like when you first hear the reference, but it is a big change, and it's going to make, I think, things so much easier on all of us, but we have to try to not get overwhelmed and overthink it, which is easy to do. For many years, we all know this, the common practice has been that the original offer and each counteroffer following that had their own separate expiration date and time. Unfortunately, this often caused confusion. Some agents believe that even if a previous offer or counteroffer had already expired, a new counteroffer signed before its own expiration could still be binding. In reality, that is not the case. This misunderstanding led to contract disputes and frustration between agents, buyers, and sellers. Contract law is clear, and if attorneys get involved, they're going to look right at this section. Once a document expires, no response is binding, whether it's an acceptance or a counteroffer, unless the parties agree in writing, usually through an addendum, to make it binding. Often, as we know, by extending that original offer deadline and making the expiration later than when it was responded to. To simplify the process and reduce this confusion, ORF has redefined how expiration dates work in the sale agreement and counteroffers. The offer deadline in the sale agreement found in Section 50, Offer to Purchase, now applies to the original offer and all subsequent counteroffers, unless it's extended in writing in one of those counteroffers or in an addendum. If the deadline is extended, that new date applies to all documents, previous and future, until it's changed again. So now there's one single universal offer deadline. Can I hear a hip, hip, hooray? If we change it here in this blank on the counteroffer, that automatically extends the offer deadline to the date here and the deadline of this new counteroffer and future counteroffers unless it gets changed again. This eliminates the need to create multiple expiration dates unless that's the specific intent of the party, so the option is still there. In the counteroffer form, Section 2 is now titled Offer Deadline, not Counteroffer Deadline. It states that the offer deadline referring to the date and time on the original offer and the counteroffer being responded to, as well as the counteroffer being prepared, is extended to the new date and time written in the blank provided. If no new date and time is entered, the deadline from the previous document still applies. While this change may seem a little confusing at first, it actually simplifies the process. There is now just one universal offer deadline to track rather than separate deadlines for each counteroffer. We understand this is a significant change in practice and encourage clear communication between agents, buyers, and sellers to ensure everyone understands the expectations and timing involved in the negotiation process. But honestly, as it starts to sink in for you guys, it will make complete sense, and it makes things so much simpler and no more arguing over the fact that you didn't include an extension of the expired offer when you prepared this new counteroffer. Next are updates to the backup offer addendum. The new language in Section 3, Termination of First Position Transaction, says that timelines based on the effective date will commence on the day after the seller's delivery of the seller's notice to the backup buyer, which is defined as the position notice. Section 3, therefore, was simplified to provide only one option for determining when timelines in the sale agreement begin. Additionally, the notice forms that were previously included within this addendum have now been separated into their own standalone forms. As a result, references to those notice sections have been removed from the addendum. The two new notice forms are 009A, seller's notice to backup buyer, and 009B, backup buyer's notice to seller. We'll review both of these new forms shortly. The backup offer addendum now refers directly to those forms in Sections 3 and 4. And finally, Section 5 was slightly modified to state the buyer represents that they are not currently a party to a contract to purchase another property and will not become a party to another contract while in backup position. So if your buyer in backup position finds another property that they want to buy, they've got to terminate their backup position first. These updates make the form clearer and more consistent while ensuring all parties understand when timelines begin and what the parties' obligations are while the buyer is in a backup position. Our next update covers the seller's notice to backup buyer and the backup buyer's notice to seller. So here are those two new forms. They look like new forms, but the content in both forms is identical to the information that previously appeared at the end of the backup offer addendum, which is confusing. You complete the backup offer addendum, and then there's these additional sections that you're not going to complete until sometime in the future. So we're trying to eliminate that from all of the forms at ORIF and create separate notice forms. The only change is that it's been moved into a separate form. Next, we'll look at the updates made to the residential condominium sale agreement. The two additions that were made in response to multiple subscriber requests can be found in Section 21, parking space or garage, and Section 22, storage space. And you can see both of those on your screen. Section 21 allows the buyer to identify a parking space, garage number, or location description for the parking area included with their purchase of the condominium. It also includes checkboxes to indicate whether the parking is owned or leased. If it is leased, there's space to note the amount and the frequency of the lease payment. Similarly, Section 22, storage space, allows the buyer to identify a storage space number that's included with the condominium purchase. This section also includes boxes to indicate whether the storage space is owned or leased, and if it is leased, to identify the amount and frequency of the lease payment. These additions make it easier to document parking and storage arrangements clearly within the sale agreement, reducing the need for additional addenda or side agreements. Parking and storage spaces are generally assigned to units in the condominium's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs. Sometimes unit owners swap parking for storage spaces, right, just to complicate our job as realtors, resulting in closing or post-closing problems. Sellers agents should ask their clients whether what is written here is accurate and compare it to the legal description of the condo unit in the title report. So you do have the ability to confirm the accuracy of this. Buyer's agents should ask sellers agents whether this information has been verified so that there are no surprises. The ORIF listing agreement, exclusive, oh, and I hope you're all using it because it's so awesome, was released in May of 2025. It has been proven to be very popular with subscribers, so it's getting a lot of use, and as a result of some feedback we've received since May, as well as the changes resulting from House Bill 3137 lurking out there, it has received a couple of updates. This year's changes include an update to Section 1, you can see that on your screen, parties, changing the reference from the supervising principal broker to authorized principal broker. So trying to comply with that 3137 new term, authorized principal broker. And then next, subsection 20F was added to confirm the seller's agent's ability to assign other agents to also work with the seller as additional seller's agents. The recommendation and recommended best practice for consumer transparency is still to confirm the addition of these agents using the listing agreement addendum, unless those agents are already disclosed as part of a team disclosure. And remember to include these additional agents in the final agency acknowledgement at the beginning of the residential real estate sale agreement. So there's just so many pieces to agency, guys, if this section allows a listing agent to say, hey, Bob in my office is going to help me with this listing. But if you do that, it's really a good idea to make sure your seller acknowledges that Bob's included in writing. And if you're in the middle of a transaction, you're going to need to add them to the sale agreement as part of the final agency acknowledgement as an agent representing the seller. So keep those pieces in mind. We also added new fields for client contact information and the firm's mailing address in response to subscriber requests. These fields appear near the end of the document. In the client contact information section, located near the seller's signature lines, you'll now see spaces for each seller's name, phone number, email address, and mailing address if it's different from the property address. In the seller's agent signature section, there's now also a field for the firm's mailing address. Next are the minor updates to the advisory regarding lead-based paint. We broadened the advisory so that it now applies to both buyers and sellers instead of only sellers. It informs buyers and sellers of their rights and obligations. One substantial change appears in section 1D, which adds 2 new sentences, and those are highlighted on your screen. The inspection is not mandatory. If the parties agree to close before the end of the 10-day end of the 10 calendar day period, buyer must waive the inspection in writing. This was included to clarify that the inspection is optional. We all know that, right? The buyer can select the 10-day inspection period and not waive it and then not have one. But if closing is going to occur while that 10-day window is still open, the lead-based paint law doesn't allow for that. So you have to then have the buyer waive it so that they can close early. Next, let's review the updates to the vacant land addendum. This is the disclosure addendum. The entire form received minor formatting and language updates to improve consistency and readability. The changes are in section 3E, where new questions were added about capped wells. Key changes are in section 3E. These additions help ensure that buyers receive more complete information about any capped wells, so they can decide whether further investigation is needed as part of their due diligence. So now if there's a capped well on the property, buyer's going to know about it and choose how they want to proceed. As we mentioned earlier, most of the timeline language related to lead-based paint was removed from the sale agreement and now appears in the lead-based paint disclosure addendum. So as a result, there are a number of changes. In section 1, lead warning statement, a new sentence has been added advising both the buyer and seller to review the advisory regarding lead-based paint. So that's new and it's highlighted on your screen. 2 changes were made to section 2. Section A still states that the seller's agent has informed the seller of their obligations under the law. I'm not going to read that, 42 U.S.C. blah, 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 and is aware of the seller's agent's responsibility to ensure compliance with the law. There is now space here for the seller's agent's initials. Subsection B is new. It states that if the buyer's agent will receive compensation from the seller, which we know happens commonly in transactions, the buyer's agent has the same obligation that the seller's agent has. The buyer's agent must inform the seller of their obligations under the law and must be aware of the buyer's agent's responsibility to ensure compliance, the seller's compliance with the law. The buyer's agent will initial if the buyer's agent is receiving compensation from the seller, but they'll enter NA if they're not receiving any compensation from the seller. Note that the form includes live links. You can see on your screen that those are live links to the statute and rule referred to in this section in case you or your client want more information. It feels overwhelming and it's awkward and it's HUD created. So without regard to how we as realtors manage our businesses or agency law, they've now put the buyer's agent in a position of having to ensure compliance with a party that is not their client. So you're going to want to talk to your managing principal broker about what they want to see when it comes to it. And read the law. It's not very complicated. Go use those links and click through and see what it says you're responsible for. And just so we're clear, regardless of agency, it doesn't matter if the buyer's agent represents the seller. It doesn't matter if the seller doesn't have any representation and there's only a buyer's agent involved. If the buyer's agent is being compensated by the seller, Section B applies and the buyer's agent must initial. Section 3, seller's disclosure, has also been updated to comply with the new EPA changes. Each option now requires the seller to initial their selections instead of utilizing a checkbox like in the previous versions. Requiring initials instead of checkboxes is the EPA's way of making clear who should be initialing each statement. Section 4 has also been updated. Excuse me, let me show that to you. to require initials instead of checkboxes. So everywhere you saw checkboxes on the lead-based paint disclosure addendum previously now requires initials by either agents or clients. At the end of section 4, there is also a new statement explaining that the buyer will not provide the risk assessment report to the seller unless the seller makes a written request using the notice from seller to buyer. If the seller makes that request, the buyer agrees to provide a copy. Finally, section 5, right of termination, explains the buyer's ability to end the transaction. The buyer may terminate at any time during the risk assessment period. They may also terminate within a default of 2 business days after the seller delivers the addendum, the EPA pamphlet, and all required lead-based paint documents, or within 2 business days after receiving any supplement that includes new material information. The end of this delivery period is referred to as the lead-based paint contingency deadline. So we've got a 2 business day window in here if the seller comes across additional documents that they failed to provide originally to allow the buyer to review those and terminate the transaction. If the buyer chooses to terminate, they must deliver the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval to the seller before 5:00 p.m. on the last day of the lead-based paint contingency deadline. When this notice is properly delivered, the buyer's earnest money deposit must be refunded. Next up is the buyer's repair addendum. In section 1, the form now clarifies that if the seller wants a copy of the buyer's inspection report, the seller must make that request in writing using the notice from seller to buyer. So that's an addition, that's new, that highlighted portion of the sentence. This aligns the addendum with the process that's already outlined in the residential real estate sale agreement, and it's intended to reduce situations where agents request the inspection report without the seller being the one who asked for it. Remember, anything an agent receives, if you receive a document, it's considered received by your client. So you don't want to be asking for things that your client hasn't asked for. So now it needs to be done in writing using ORF 110. Next, we're going to take a look at the changes and updates made to both the buyers and sellers' repair addenda. These changes were made in response to subscriber concerns about situations where a seller either does not complete the agreed upon repairs or completes them in a way that is not acceptable to the buyer. The updated forms now include a verification and re-verification process along with the requirement for the buyer to notify the seller if any repairs are incomplete, as well as timelines for when those repairs must be addressed. Section 4. Verification has been revised in response to subscriber comments. The term reinspection has been changed to verification, and the requirement of the buyer's inspector to attend has been revised. So I think we'll all say yippee for that. Now the buyer's inspector is required to attend the previously referred to as reinspection, but now the verification appointment, only if the repairs involve heating, cooling, plumbing, electrical systems, the roof, or if a permit was required, since those repairs need professional confirmation. Other repairs, if the buyer wants to go on their own to verify they're done, they have the ability to do that with their agent, of course. This section still includes a default of 2 business days from the seller's notice of completion for the buyer to complete the verification, known as the verification period. The form also clarifies that this verification step is not a reinspection, and it does not extend the original inspection period. Section 4.1, repair acceptance, explains that if the buyer does not deliver the notice from buyer to seller during the verification period, the repairs are considered accepted. Section 4.2, incomplete repairs, is entirely new. It states that if the buyer determines during the verification period that any repairs are incomplete or unsatisfactory, the buyer will deliver the notice from buyer to seller, along with evidence that supports the concern. After receiving that notice, the seller has a default of 2 business days to correct the deficiencies, and then they must deliver the notice from seller to buyer confirming the repairs are now complete. This creates what's now called the extended completion date. These updates help ensure a more structured and transparent process for handling repairs so both parties know exactly what is required and when it must be done. Section 5, re-verification, is also entirely new. It gives the buyer a default of 2 business days after the extended completion date to determine whether the repairs identified in the incomplete repairs notice have now been completed in a workmanlike manner. The section also explains that the final re-verification period is simply a confirmation of completed repairs and not a re-inspection, and it does not extend the original inspection period. As with the earlier verification step, if any of the repairs involve heating, cooling, plumbing, electrical systems, the roof, or work that required a permit, the buyer must use their original inspector to complete the re-verification. If the inspector determines the repairs are complete, the buyer is considered to have accepted the repairs. If the inspector determines the repairs are still incomplete, this becomes the last opportunity for the seller to complete the repairs. And the seller must promptly complete the remaining work at the seller's expense using a contractor chosen by the buyer. Notice that. That's at the very end of this sentence, last sentence, end of the paragraph. This is a penalty. What has happened, and we know there are both unreasonable sellers and unreasonable buyers in transactions, and repairs can become very contentious. But in the case where we have a seller who just plain isn't completing the repairs or completing them correctly, if they get 2 chances basically to complete the repairs. First chance, they complete them, it's all done and over with. After the second chance, if they still have not completed the repairs, then they get to complete them using the buyer's contractor. So that hopefully will encourage sellers to get them done the second time around before they're forced to use a contractor that's not of their choosing. So we have a clear and structured second opportunity for the buyer to confirm that repairs have been completed. It also places an incentive on the seller to make sure repairs are properly finished after the final verification period or face the penalty. So we hope this just kind of provides closure for the circular repair issues. Now let's take a look at the updates made to Section 1, parties, in both the exclusive and non-exclusive buyer representation agreements. The first change involves the order of the fields in this section. They were rearranged to make it clear that the agreement is between the buyer and the firm, not between the buyer and the individual agent. This helps to reinforce the structure of agency in Oregon and avoids confusion about who the buyer is actually contracting with. A new clarifying sentence was also added. It states, as used below in this representation agreement, the term buyer's agent will refer collectively to the buyer's agent, the firm, the buyer's agent's managing principal broker, and any of the firm's other real estate agents assisting buyer's agent in the representation of buyer. So just making sure it's all encompassing. Both the exclusive and non-exclusive buyer representation agreements also now include new fields for client contact information. These fields capture each buyer's phone number, email, and mailing address. The goal is to ensure that all essential contact information is gathered in one place so the agreement is more complete, just like the listing agreement. We've heard concern about Section 14, insurance and destruction, in the agreement to occupy after closing. Many subscribers do not want to share the buyer's address with the seller during the transaction, so that field was removed. Since the form requires proof of coverage to be delivered before closing, the most practical approach is for agents to exchange that documentation on behalf of their clients. So the buyer's address field was removed. Okay, are there any questions on the changes we've covered so far, ladies?
Yes, we have a couple. One is back when you were talking about the offer deadline. Can you maybe go into that or kind of try to summarize that again and how the counteroffer piece works in there? Someone's asking for a real life example for how that date is extended.
Sure. So, okay, right now, buyer writes an offer. And let's say that they make a deadline, what's today, the 16th. So the deadline for the seller to accept the offer or respond to the offer is the 17th, tomorrow. That's pretty typical, right? 1 or 2 days. The seller decides to counter. They prepare a counteroffer tomorrow and send it over to the buyer's agent. However, it's probably unrealistic that the buyer's going to have a chance to also respond by that deadline, because now the offer deadline stays in place for that seller's counteroffer. So if the deadline was tomorrow, that would only give the buyer until tomorrow to respond to the seller's counteroffer. So in the offer deadline blank on the counteroffer, they would want to extend that deadline and maybe make it a day or two further out. So that's an example where the seller is responding in time. Now let's look at the example where a buyer writes an offer, it expires tomorrow, and the seller is skiing and doesn't have a chance to get home and review the offer and sign the counteroffer until the following day, Thursday. Now, if on the counteroffer they put a new expiration date of Friday, that date applies to both the original offer. So we've extended the offer as well as that new counteroffer. So the idea is to not have to keep adding sentences or adding addenda to clarify expiration dates, but to just fill it in the blank, and it encompasses all of the counteroffers and the offer that exist so far and do not exist yet unless they're subsequently modified again. You think that helps, Sarah?
Yeah, that was great. I think so. And then if they have more follow-up questions, we can put them in the Q&A.
Yes.
We have another one about the repair addendum or the repair process. So asking if the repair is not completed satisfactorily, can the seller just terminate, or are they obligated to finish the repair that they originally agreed to, even if it gets to that last step where the buyer can select the contractor?
Well, the seller never has the right to terminate. No, it's a buyer contingency. So if the seller is not completing the repairs adequately, meeting the buyer's desires, then they're obligated to use the buyer's contractor if they haven't gotten it done after the re-verification period is up. So nope, the seller can't terminate.
That's it for now.
That's it. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for paying attention and bringing up questions, because I know that it's easy to have questions and then we hesitate and don't want to ask, and then it just lurks out there. So let's move on here to the termination agreement. So the termination agreement received several updates this year. The most visible change is to the title of the agreement, which is now Termination Agreement and Deposit Disbursement Instructions. And you can't see that because we don't have the whole form on the slide, but the title at the top of the form is Termination Agreement and Deposit Disbursement Instructions. And this update reflects the fact that the form does contain two separate agreements within one document. The termination agreement is one agreement, and the deposit disbursement instructions is another agreement. They are related, but they function independently of each other. So you'll notice that each agreement is now clearly labeled with its own black title bar. So you can see the termination agreement section on your screen. The first portion at the top of the form is the termination agreement. The second portion, identified by the black bar in the middle of the page, is the deposit disbursement instructions. At the end of the termination agreement portion, you'll see signature lines for both the buyer and the seller. These signatures apply only to the termination agreement portion of the form. Several changes were made, however, to the deposit instructions portion of the form to improve clarity. The first sentence now identifies the entity named in the blank as the deposit holder. So we now have a title to reference. Section 1 is now titled Disbursement Instructions, and directs the deposit holder to distribute the deposits. There's also space to list the total amount being held. Below that, you'll see 4 blank lines. Each line includes a space to list an amount and identify the party who will receive that amount. In many transactions, only 1 line will be used, but 4 lines are available if the deposit needs to be divided between multiple parties, persons, or entities. Section 2 is now titled Additional Agreements and includes 2 subsections, stating that the parties agree to sign any additional documents required by the deposit holder and confirming that the parties release the real estate agents, principal brokers, firms, employees, and representatives from any further liability related to the disbursement of the funds. Section 3, Withholding of Deposits and Deposit Disputes, addresses what happens when the termination agreement portion is signed, but the deposit instructions portion is not. And have we ever seen that happen? Only about 50% of the time, right? In that situation, the transaction is terminated. If that top portion is signed, it's terminated. But the deposit holder will continue to hold the funds until the dispute is resolved under the dispute resolution section of the sale agreement. At the bottom of the deposit instructions section, there are signature lines for the buyer and seller. And again, these signatures only apply to the deposit instructions portion of the form. These updates make it clear that the document contains 2 separate agreements, one that ends the transaction and one that directs how the funds are to be dispersed. Both parties must sign each section for that part of the agreement to take effect. Hopefully that all makes sense. Several notice and contingency forms in the ORF library were updated this year, including the contingency removal addendum, the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval, the notice from buyer to seller, and the notice from seller to buyer. These forms received the necessary revisions so that they align with the new language and updates made in the ORF library. So you'll see some changes, but we chose for time purposes not to include a review of each of these documents to look at those forms. They include the addition of references to the revised appraisal, suitability, and loan contingencies, along with other updates to match the recent revisions made to the well and septic addenda and other forms in the library. These updates ensure the documents work together smoothly and use the same language and concepts throughout. Now let's take a look at the updates made to the investment property addendum. Several revisions were introduced to improve clarity and make the information for buyers more useful. First, which you won't see on your screen, is a minor change in section 1.1D, basic information. And that was made changing the request from a copy of the current utility maintenance and operating bills to the past 3 months' bills. Then section 1.4 was added, which you see there on your screen, which requires the seller to provide any available owner association documents, reports, and financials. This helps ensure buyers have a more complete picture of the property's operational and financial structure. Section 5, material events, was also clarified. The updated wording provides a clearer definition of what qualifies as a material event and explains what types of events require the seller to obtain the buyer's permission before taking action. The section titled Seller's Notice of Unavailable Items has been removed. This section was made because the issue is already covered during the buyer's review period. If documents are missing, the buyer already has the right to terminate under the existing review period. The tenant estoppel certificate received updates throughout the form this year. The revisions focus on improving clarity and making the language easier for all parties to understand. An estoppel certificate is used when there is a tenant occupying the property. Because the income of the property is important to the buyer needs to know if the tenant agrees with the landlord on important details of the lease. These include the current rental amount, any deposits being held, whether the lease is valid and in good standing, and whether the tenant has the right to extend their lease or to buy the property. The updated language helps streamline this process so buyers receive accurate information directly from the tenant. Several updates were made to the septic and on-site sewage addendum. In section 4, a new subsection D was added that requires the seller to provide any available as-built drawings and permits, because inspectors often request these items before beginning their work, so including them helps streamline the inspection process. Section 6 also received important revisions. Subscribers noted that the previous wording made it seem as though the buyer had to give notice of termination before negotiating repairs. To correct this, the section title was changed to negotiation period. And the language now makes it clear that negotiation comes first. This section applies once the buyer has received written reports showing substantial deficiencies in the system. The buyer then has a default of 5 business days to deliver the notice from buyer to seller along with a list of those deficiencies. After that notice is delivered, the parties have a default period of 2 business days to negotiate how the deficiencies will be addressed. This is the septic negotiation period. If no agreement is reached, the buyer may terminate by delivering the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval before 5:00 p.m. on the final day of the septic negotiation period. If the buyer does not deliver the notice on time, they are considered to have accepted the condition of the system. Take a look at the updates to the private well addendum. First, there was a minor revision in Section 3, seller testing duties. The timing reference was changed from after this form is signed and delivered to after the effective date. This aligns the well addendum with the septic addendum and keeps the timelines consistent with most ORA forms. Similar to the septic form, Section 6 received revisions to clarify the termination process. The title was changed from buyer right of termination to well negotiation period. This section applies once the buyer has received written reports identifying substantial deficiencies in the well or its water. The buyer has a default of 5 business days to deliver the notice from buyer to seller along with a list of deficiencies. And after the notice is delivered, the parties have a default of 2 business days to negotiate a written agreement for addressing those deficiencies. This is the well negotiation period. If no agreement is reached, the buyer may terminate by delivering the notice of buyer's unconditional disapproval before 5:00 p.m. on the final day of the well negotiation period. In the seller's contingent right to sell addendum, the notices section that previously appeared on page 2 has been deleted and moved to the appropriate notice forms. Like we said, we're trying to get rid of those continued forms where second forms appear at the end of the first form. Including the notice within a form that's completed early in the transaction and then must be reused later to provide notice created confusion for many subscribers. So moving those over to the notice forms makes a lot more sense. The solar panel system addendum received a full update intended to simplify and speed up the process of determining what will happen with an existing solar system to help shorten the time needed to gather information. Remember, there is a new companion advisory and the sale agreement change requiring the buyer to attach the addendum to their offer. Both changes we reviewed earlier. Section 1 defines the system. Section 2 details the status of the financial agreement. Because the buyer is now attaching the addendum to their offer, the buyer's agent will need to check with the seller's agent to determine which option in this section applies. Option A is labeled owned and should be selected when the seller owns the system outright and will transfer it to the buyer at closing in as-is condition and free of financial obligations. Option B is titled subject to financial agreement. If this option is selected because the system is still under a financial agreement, the buyer must select one of 2 subsections. Sub-option 1 is used when the buyer will use their best efforts to assume the agreement, which also triggers the provisions in Section 4. Sub-option 2 is selected when the buyer will not assume any financial obligation and the seller agrees to pay off the agreement so the system can be transferred free and clear at closing. Section 3 of the solar panel addendum has a more descriptive title now, Delivery and Review of Documents. It now begins with subsection 3.1, Documents, which gives the seller a default of 3 business days after the effective date of the sale agreement to provide 3 pieces of information to the buyer. The first includes all documents related to the solar system itself. The second includes any documents related to a financial agreement, if one exists. And the third is the name and contact information for the third party associated with that financial agreement. Subsection 3.2, Review Period, gives the buyer a default of 5 business days after the seller's delivery of the documents to review them, defined as the review period. This section also includes an advisory reminding buyers to notify their lender of any financial obligations they may be assuming. The buyer may unconditionally disapprove of the documents by 5:00 p.m. on the final day of the review period, which will terminate the transaction and result in a refund of the earnest money. If the buyer does not deliver an unconditional disapproval notice by the deadline, the documents are considered approved. Section 4, Assumption of Financial Agreement, applies only when option 2B1, which we just reviewed, has been selected. It contains 2 subsections that outline the steps a buyer must take if they intend to assume the existing financial agreement on the solar system. Subsection 4.1 requires the buyer to submit their application to assume the financial agreement by the end of the next business day after the review period. The buyer and seller agree to cooperate in seeking approval from the third party holding that agreement. Subsection 4.2, Assumption Contingency, gives the buyer a default of 10 business days after submitting their application to provide one of 3 notices to the seller. Option A notifies the seller that the third party approved the application and thereby satisfies the contingency. Option B states that the application was not approved, which terminates the transaction. And option C notifies the seller that the buyer will provide evidence showing that they will instead satisfy the financial agreement at or before closing. This section also includes a reminder that if the buyer does not deliver one of these notices within the assumption period, they lose the right to terminate under this contingency. Section 5 provides space for additional terms the parties may want to include. The referral agreement was the only form in the ORIF library that used a multi-column layout. This layout has been changed so that instead of having a buyer section and an almost identical seller section, the agent selects which client the form is for, making the form easier to use. Other language was modified to create clarity and consistency, so just minor changes to the referral agreement other than formatting. ORIF received several questions this year about the buyers and sellers agents' instructions to escrow. Subscribers were unsure how to complete the line that read, "Firm, checks, or wires will be sent to," followed by a blank. In the compensation and instructions section, to remove this confusion, the Forms Committee chose to delete that language entirely. The section has been revised to identify that escrow will coordinate directly with the agent's firm for wiring or check instructions. This update reflects the process escrow already follows anyway and ensures that agents no longer need to guess at how to fill in that blank that existed previously. Are there any questions so far? We're almost done, guys, so want to do a little catch-all here for questions.
Nope, we're good.
All right. Now we're all getting ready to be done with this. This is a list of changes made to all the forms in the residential library. We've updated, of course, the release date in the footer, and that is used to confirm you're using the most recent version of the forms. So do take a look at it once those forms are released after the first of the year. One exciting change in this list, based on subscriber feedback, is the addition of signature lines for up to 4 sellers and 4 buyers. This is the time when I wish all your mics were unmuted and you could all say, yay! You no longer have to squeeze in signature sections. You can have up to 4 buyers and sellers on every document in the library, starting in 2026. And finally, before we go, a reminder that the ORIF Forms Committee acts on feedback from all of you. If you have a question about a form or a suggestion to improve a form already in the library, please reach out to ORIF at customerservice@OREF online or give them a call. You can see the phone numbers right there on your screen, 503-912-2569. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone. I hope you find this update provided useful information, and don't hesitate to reach out to ORIF if you have questions about anything you heard today.